Céad míle fáilte River Galair, 100,000 welcomes to you to the room of Brian McMahon on Máistir, the Master. To everybody else in the world, Brian would have been known as the playwright, the poet, the short story writer, even the storyteller. But to the young people of Listowel, he was known affectionately as the Máistir, and the children loved him. He had a way of shaping people's minds by using the imagination, and wherever he could, he made sure that there was a level playing field. You can see behind me that there's an elephant coming in the door of the Máistir's room. That comes from a famous time when the circus came to Listowel. Not everybody's pockets were made as deep as one another, and some children couldn't afford to go. So he had a little cogger mugger with the circus folk, and a little treat was organised. As the day went on in the school, there was a little knock on the door, and when somebody went to open it, a baby elephant was standing outside. With a teacher like that, wouldn't you grow up full of dreams? Wouldn't you grow up thinking that anything is possible? And you can see there the shan uckle that he used. Mullan oiga agus tiukikshi. Praise the young people and they'll come on. Wise words that we could even use to this day. Standing in Brian McMahon's room, I come to you now with a little story of my own. Brian loved nature. He loved the simple things of life and the little transactions that went on between everybody. And this story, written in the second year of COVID, is also based on those ideals. There was a young boy and his name was Crahor, and he lived in a beautiful place called Castletown Kinna in West Cork. It was a place of wide open fields, of little animals dancing at their edges, a little forest that a young boy could get lost in, climbing trees and making adventures. But it was also a place where you could come to stillness. And Crahor learned at such a young age to become so still that even the rabbits felt safe in walking up towards him and looking deep into his eyes, into the window of his soul. Crahor loved it there. He loved to run in those fields and shout to the sky, and there was days that the birds answered him back. But then came the news from his father. We're not making enough money, lad. We're going to move the family to Cork, to the Big Smoke. We'll get on better there. In Crahor's memory, he was pulled, kicking and screaming from his beautiful wide fields to the place of the narrow streets, to the place where people had hunched shoulders and wore worried expressions on their faces. When he went to school there, they looked in the roll and they said, Crahor, Crahor, we'll call him Connor. Sure, 'tis the same name anyway. But it wasn't the same to Crahor, and he found that he himself was now carrying little worries on his shoulders, and he himself was developing the little 2 lines of worry just over his nose. Time passed, as it almost must, and then it came to a time in the world where everybody went into lockdown. Crahor found himself enjoying these times. He could open his door and step out, and he'd be so happy because he'd have the place to himself. He'd start picking the smera dova, collecting them away, knowing that nobody was going to bother him. People wore masks, and he began to feel that it was like a place of ghosts, because when the people wore masks, they looked down. They forgot to look at one another. One of those days, when people were taking a respite from the COVID lockdown, when there was a little bit of a relaxation of the rules, he decided to take a walk through the cold quay of Cork, and he came to the shop that always cheered him up. It was called Dervish. It had beautiful purple walls, and inside the windows there was all sorts of sparkly stones that would beckon you in. But this day, sitting on the window ledge, there was an old woman. She was so old that all the wrinkles on her face moved around when she smiled at you. And she smiled at him now. She twinkled at him, and he couldn't help it. He twinkled back. She put out her two small hands to him, and he couldn't resist. He put out his two big hands to her, and she caught one, and she gave a big squeeze to that part, that fine fat part just under your thumb. He couldn't explain it, but it made him feel better, and it made him think of the long ago times in Castletown, Kenna. An Fia Bán, she said. An Fia Bán. No, he said, my name is Crahor, and he surprised himself at calling himself by his old name. Fia Bán, boy, Fia Bán. And he just smiled at her. And then he left and crossed the bridge and started to go up the steps, the rock steps towards his home on Shandon Street. And he found himself singing an old tune, a tune that his grandmother would sing long ago when she was making bread. Avaka tu mavokali mavorninog mahemishin. Avaka tu mavokali is igual she's on boher. By the time he got home, his grandmother's face had come out of its memory cupboard, and she was smiling at him every time he closed his eyes. He remembered her beautiful brown bread. He couldn't stop thinking about that brown bread. So he opened the cupboard and he took down the big wide bowl. You need a big wide bowl if you're to make proper brown bread. Then he threw in the ingredients, a handful of this, a little snip of that, just like she taught him. And before long, the smell of fresh, beautiful brown Irish soda bread was making its way through the cottage. He took down the jam that he'd made from the smeara duva that were everywhere during these strange times, and he smothered it in generous amounts on top of the brown bread. He bit into it, enjoying every single bite. That night, he couldn't sleep. There was a big full moon over Cork City, and she was tickling his spirit and reminding him of the memories of long ago in Castletown, Kenna. He looked out his window and he saw that the Ceodriachta Corky, the magic mists of Cork, were beginning to thicken and beginning to move out of the River Lee and beginning to come towards his own little house. He couldn't help it. He put on his clothes, he opened the door, and he danced out into the moonlight. It was as if the Ceodriachta, the magic mist, was showing him the way to go. He crossed the bridge, he went down the narrow streets until he came to the Western Road. He turned right and he began to walk towards the tallest building in Cork City, the Cork County Hall, down the Lee fields. And the Lee was like a silver ribbon under the black velvet night. Kyo Drieta Kirky became thicker and thicker, and he fancied that he began to see things in the mist. He went to his favourite tree, and there he saw her, An Fia Bán, the white deer. Sure, the woman had told him. There was no need for words between the Fia Bán and him. He heard her deep in his heart, and he knew that she heard him. O Macree, Conas Atatu, Tar Cuam, oh my heart, how are you? Come to me, come to me. And because he couldn't help it, he found himself moving towards her as if in a dream. Oh, he said, things are heavy now. People wear their worries on their shoulders. You can see it on their faces. Oh, Makushla, oh, the one that is the very pulse in my blood. Is that how it is in Éire now? Ah, well, it's a big wheel, and it will turn again, Macree. It will turn again, my own dear heart. But in the meantime, would you like to come with me to Tir na Nog, to the land of the forever young? And when everyone is happy in Ireland again, and young boys run under the big free sky, you can come back. She held out her hand, and in answer, he placed his hand in hers, and he stepped into the mist. I hope you liked my story in this beautiful room. If you ever want a little bit of magic, then I would say to you, come to the Kerry Writers Museum. Sit in the rooms of the great masters. You can't follow any better footsteps than that. Thank you, and we'll see you again.